day. In my last video, I said that it was far from certain that I would be able to make a video for Monday because, of course, on Monday I'm travelling back from Switzerland to London. Well, I have managed to make a video, but it is going to be a short one. Time to make a longer video is not available. Some, of course, of you who complain about the length of my videos for some cause might find that a cause for relief. But anyway, let's get straight in to discuss what remains, I'm afraid, the major topic in the world today, which is, of course, the conflict in Ukraine. Now, I am not going to devote today much discussion to the situation on the battlefronts. It seems to me that it remains stuck where it has been since the middle of June. First 2 weeks of Ukraine's offensive after the 4th of June, the offensive began on the 4th of June, were marked by furious activity as Ukraine sent large numbers of men, large numbers of armoured vehicles towards the Russian front lines in the south, on the southern fronts, principally from the town of Orechov, trying to capture Tokmak and ultimately Melitopol and breaking through to the Sea of Azov. And there was, of course, alongside that attack, further attacks along the Vremevka ledge, somewhat to the east, and also attacks near Pyatikhatki on the east coast of the Dnieper River, trying to push further south into eastern Kherson region. Every one of these attacks has been repulsed with huge losses in men and machines, and Ukraine has in no place reached the major Russian fortified lines, the great defense lines that the Russians constructed in the autumn and winter and spring, and with the dragon's teeth and the minefields and the elaborate trench systems. In no single place has Ukraine even reached these great fortified lines. It has in every case been driven back, failing to break through the zone of control around 15 kilometers in front of these fortified lines. It's never managed to penetrate that particular zone. And since this failure in the first 2 weeks, we've seen Ukraine try different tactics. It's attempted to switch the focus of its offensive back to the Bakhmut region. Not entirely clear what Ukraine has been seeking to achieve there, but it's been launching attacks in places like Kleshevkaya, Kordumyovka, villages near Bakhmut itself, or the former Bakhmut. The Russians, of course, called it Artyomovsk. And there's been intense fighting, but again, there's not been any breakthrough. And we have had that strange incident, that complex incident of a Ukrainian landing party on the east bank of Kherson region near the Antonovsky Bridge, opposite from Kherson city, which the Russians abandoned in the autumn on the west bank. And the Ukrainians established a small bridgehead on the east bank, and the Russians have now confirmed, the Russian Defense Ministry has now confirmed that that bridgehead has been completely eliminated. Again, hundreds of Ukrainian soldiers were sacrificed in an attempt to establish a bridgehead which was ultimately unsuccessful. In no part of the battlefronts have the Ukrainians broken through, and the overwhelming consensus amongst analysts who've been plotting and following the war carefully is that Ukraine's losses have been on an enormous scale, multiple times greater than the Russian losses. And of course, on top of this, we've seen these reports, this survey carried out in Ukraine by this Kiev Institute, which tells us that 78% of Ukrainian respondents now confirm that they know people, in most cases several people, who have either been killed or wounded in this conflict. So, standstill across the front lines, increasingly desperate comments from President Zelensky. Now, President Zelensky spent the weekend, as I discussed in my previous video, rejecting any suggestion of a compromise, saying that Ukraine would only negotiate with Russia once every inch of what he said was Ukrainian territory, including Crimea, was returned to Ukraine, a maximalist position which I think pretty much everybody now acknowledges is unrealistic. But anyway, that was the position that he has publicly taken and which he is sticking by. And in the meantime, he's also made a number of other increasingly desperate statements which have been noticed in the US media, in which he has called on the Ukrainian army to carry out at least some significant advance before the 11th of July, when NATO is due to meet in Vilnius for its annual summit meeting. And the implication again is that if the offensive remains at a standstill by the 11th of July, then with the fractures and divisions in NATO now starting to become increasingly visible, Western support for Ukraine may start to fade, with some indications that I have now seen from some Western officials that they believe that without Western support, if there was a total cut-off of Western support, Ukraine would collapse within about 2 weeks. That is as much time as they give for Ukraine to continue the conflict. In other words, Ukraine has now found itself in a state of complete dependence on the West. And this brings us to an aspect of this war that is perhaps not commented upon enough. On the one hand, Ukraine is now totally dependent upon the West. It cannot continue to prosecute this war without Western aid. It's now largely accepted that in terms of its military equipment, its ammunition supplies, its aircraft supplies, supplies of tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, and of course, in terms of general support for its economy, it is now in a condition of total dependence upon the West. And you would assume from that that this gives the West enormous leverage over Ukraine, which of course in a sense it does. And Ukraine has found itself in a kind of trap of dependence. It says that it is fighting this war to achieve independence from Russia, which it often speaks of as its former imperial overlord. But what it has actually achieved as a result of this war is total dependence on the West. But if we see a situation where the West possesses a kind of theoretical leverage over Ukraine, we also see something else, which is that the West, for its part, now finds itself, to a degree which Western leaders perhaps never anticipated, trapped in this conflict and dangerously dependent on decisions by Ukrainian officials. Now, if we go back to the events of last March last year and April last year, where Ukraine and Russia negotiated what was a draft agreement, a draft treaty, as President Putin has described it, in which the outlines of a peace agreement between them were reached. Well, what we know, what we have been told by various parties to those discussions, the Turkish foreign minister of the time, Mr. Cavusoglu, the Israeli prime minister of that time, Mr. Naftali Bennett, what we know is that the Western powers, principally the United States and Britain, persuaded Ukraine to go back on all the agreements it had reached with the Russians over the course of that negotiation and to continue the war. And we know that the Western leaders engaged in a stick and carrot strategy with Ukraine. On the one hand, they said that if Ukraine went ahead with that agreement, the Western powers, the United States and Britain, would refuse to participate in the treaty and would not agree to be amongst the powers that would grant Ukraine security guarantees, which both the Russians and Ukrainians agreed would be a central part of that agreement. And that was the stick. It meant that Ukraine would in effect have been thrown back on dependence on the Russians, because the only guarantor power that would have come forward in that case would have been Russia, though perhaps China and some of the other countries in the non-aligned world might have been agreed to become guarantors as well. But Ukraine would have lost the support of the West. But alongside that stick, it's now increasingly clear that there was also a carrot, which is that the British and the Americans, Boris Johnson first and foremost, but also President Biden and his officials, promised Ukraine that they would support Ukraine for however long it took and give Ukraine whatever it needed in order to defeat the Russians. And what has of course happened is that, having given that open-ended promise, that effective blank check, what the Americans and the British are increasingly starting to find is that Ukraine is continuously cashing it. It is coming back, demanding for more and more weapons, more tanks, more guns, more shells, more aircraft, more missiles, far more than the United States especially ever anticipated that it would need to provide, and in fact more in many cases than the United States can itself produce. And what we now see is that the United States, the government of the United States, is to some extent, as a result of that promise it gave Ukraine back in March and April of last year, in a position where its policies on the Ukrainian issue appear to have been captured by Ukrainian officials, people like not just Zelensky, but people like his advisor Mikhailo Podolyak, others like Dmytro Kuleba, the Ukrainian foreign minister, Kirill Budanov, the intelligence chief. Anyway, Ukrainian officials who, relying upon this American blank check, this American promise, have now been encouraged to make maximalist demands, which I suspect even the United States now quietly realizes it cannot be achieved, creating a situation where eventually Ukraine will find that this blank check that it has been given, the United States at some point is going to have to refuse to honor. And we're starting to see increasing evidence of people in the United States, in the West, beginning to have doubts. And we have now seen a report that the German government has refused, for example, to provide Taurus long-range missiles to Ukraine. These are very similar to the British Storm Shadow missiles that have proved only partially successful. The Pentagon is trying to push back on demands for F-16s from Ukraine and ATACMS long-range missiles. And as Zelensky says, there's increasing talk within NATO of some sort of negotiation process needing to be launched. Now, all of this is familiar, but one thing I had overlooked in my previous videos is a rather mysterious meeting that took place in Copenhagen in Denmark a couple of days ago between the United States, US officials, and officials from the various BRICS states, but not, of course, Russia. And apparently there were officials from India and China there, and from other states, South Africa as well. Turkey, which of course is not a BRICS state, was also represented. But it seems that this was a meeting which the United States hoped would result not just in some of these countries being persuaded to water down their support for Russia, but perhaps to agree to press the Russians into agreeing to negotiations, some form of negotiations, once this offensive, which, as I said, for the moment has ground to a halt, once this offensive has finally run its course. And it's not at all clear what happened at this meeting in Copenhagen, but it's a reasonable guess that one day when the history of this conflict is written, we will learn a great deal more, and we will find that this meeting was perhaps one of the most difficult meetings that has taken place, that the US officials have been trying to persuade the representatives of all of these countries to at least understand the American point of view, but that they might have found that these countries were not particularly responsive at this time. I say that because if they had been responsive, I am sure by now that we would have heard about it. We would have seen something appear in the American media at the very least. And I'm going to say that perhaps the reason why this meeting in Copenhagen probably didn't go particularly well is because of the people that the United States sent to that meeting. Apparently, Tony Blinken was there, and Victoria Nuland was there, and frankly, it's not likely that these people whose diplomatic skills are not perhaps of the highest order were the right people to send to a meeting like this, exploring routes towards starting some kind of negotiation. So there we go, a meeting in Vilnius that's now appearing on the horizon, a deadlocked offensive of which I suspect hopes are dwindling away. It's striking that the British media, for example, has stopped providing much information about the progress of the fighting in Ukraine, and given how invested Britain has become in this conflict, that is an important indication in itself. And it looks as if, as I said, for the moment, it is the Russians who are making the running, who are preparing their positions, who might very well be planning some offensives of their own, perhaps in the autumn or the winter, who are training troops, increasing supplies of weapons, increasing shell production to levels far beyond what the United States, it seems, can achieve, who are building up their forces towards, well, we do not know to what end. I will say that it is, again, a sharp contrast to learn of the fact that apparently around 1,300 Russians are volunteering to join the military every day now, and are apparently going through a process of at least 7 months training, and sometimes longer, as they are gradually inducted into increasing numbers of reserve units, which are being equipped with all these weapons that have been churned out by Russia's burgeoning military-industrial complex. And to see the contrast in these increasingly desperate pictures of Ukrainian mobilization, which has now apparently been extended to Western Ukraine, with Ukraine continuously watering down the age restrictions, the health restrictions for soldiers that it is now trying to call up. In one case, one could see a systematic, methodical build-up of military power. In the other case, I have to say, both within Ukraine itself, over the question of recruiting manpower, and also in the West, it's increasingly looking like scrabbling, running around trying to find men in Ukraine and shells and machines in the West that can be cobbled together in a hurry to take on the growing Russian juggernaut. And this has provoked two very interesting articles, which I'm going to just dwell on briefly and touch on over the course of this program. One is the latest article by Professor John Mearsheimer, the Dorian, if you like, of foreign policy realists in the United States. Now, he has provided a very bleak view about the prospects of the war. He predicts that it will end eventually in a Russian victory. He predicts that Ukraine is going to be partitioned, that the Russians will capture very large sections of Ukrainian territory, and will annex them and will incorporate them into Russia. The one thing that he does say is that he still doesn't think that the Russians are aiming for the complete defeat, conquest, and absorption of the entirety of Ukraine. He may be right about that, politically speaking, but he seems to have doubts that this is something that the Russians can even achieve. Now, on this issue, I have to say that given the direction of travel for the moment in this war, I lean instead towards the views expressed by people like Larry Johnson and Brian Beletic and others. And I think also increasingly some of the military commentators, some of the other military commentators, people like Daniel Davis, that whether or not the Russians intend to capture the whole of Ukraine is an open question. Putin himself still seems to suggest that he would be willing to go for a negotiated solution if one was on offer, though on harsher terms for Ukraine than those which were offered last year in March and April in Istanbul. But I agree, along with Larry Johnson and Brian Beletic and those others, Daniel Davis, that if terms are not agreed soon, the situation could become much more critical for Ukraine than Professor Mearsheimer acknowledges, and that what we could be looking at is not just a Russian victory, but perhaps something even more dramatic, which is eventually a kind of collapse with any decision as to what sort of Ukraine is left, being decided no longer in Kiev, but in Moscow. And the other article I want to talk about is one by Dmitry Trenin, who is a Russian commentator, far from being someone who could be described as a Putin loyalist. He's one of the most insightful and intelligent of Russian commentators. He has written extensively on international affairs. He's traveled to the United States. He knows the United States well. He's one of these people who has always written in a measured and composed way. And whereas Professor Mearsheimer's article is full of gloom, striking to contrast this with Dmitry Trenin's, where he speaks increasingly of growing Russian confidence. He says that the West massively underestimated the resilience of the Russian economy. He says that Russia's economy has not only held together, but that it has now been jolted out of its long-term relationship with the West in a way that is making the Russians rediscover skills that they used to have for aircraft production, production of rolling stock, complex machines, machine tools, and, by the way, consumer goods, that Russia's industrial economy is now going through a period of growth and resurgence, and we've seen increasing evidence of this. But he also talks about a major increase in Russian military production, of which I think everyone now acknowledges the reality of that. There was even an interesting report by the CSIS, the journal, if you like, of the US military industrial complex, which grudgingly conceded, very grudgingly conceded, that Russia is never going to run out of missiles. Russian ability to continue to produce these long-range cruise missiles with which Russia hammers Ukraine day after day. There's been predictions ever since March last year that Russia would run out of these missiles. Well, the CSIS, in other words, the US military industrial complex, has now recognized that that is not going to happen. And Trenin talks about that. He talks about a resilient Russian economy, a growing Russian economy, an economy which is now in macroeconomic equilibrium. And he talks also about a growing Russian military presence, growing military power. And he seems to be confident that eventually Russia will achieve whatever objectives it is seeking in Ukraine. Now, alongside that, I want to return to that survey by that Kiev Institute about the fact that 78% of Ukrainian respondents are now saying that they know not just one or two people, but multiple people who have died or been injured in this war. We must never forget the scale of the human tragedy that is playing out in Ukraine. And whatever trap Western leaders placed themselves in March or April of last year, when they recklessly and irresponsibly gave Ukraine that blank check which said, if you walk away from these negotiations, we will give you whatever you need to defeat the Russians on the battlefield. The time has come to be straightforward with the Ukrainians and to tell them that this is no longer possible, and also to be straightforward with Western publics and to acknowledge the realities that Ukraine is not winning this war and that there is no route for Ukraine to win this war, and that both in order to avoid a humanitarian catastrophe and a greater debacle, which might not happen tomorrow or next week or next month or in 6 months' time, but which is now clearly on the horizon, to avoid a debacle, a geopolitical debacle. It is time to call a stop now and to begin negotiations immediately. Now, there's been yet another article, this time by Andrei Karibko, in which he has floated the possibility. He is somebody who, as I said, is familiar with Russian thinking, and he analyzes and parses Putin's comments very carefully, and I agree with his analysis here. He thinks that Putin is still, as I said, open to some kind of negotiation. And I think this is true, but as I have been saying for a very long time, the time window for that is not indefinite, and I think that the offensives that Ukraine launched last year in the autumn seem to have misled some people to think that that time window was bigger than it was. The fact that the current offensive is in deadlock ought to have dispelled that illusion, so that the time has come to talk about talks. That, to my mind, is what the discussions in Vilnius on the 11th of July should be about. I noticed that the Austrian Chancellor has now made statements to the effect that the exclusion of Russia from Europe is not in Europe's interests, that Russia is an absolutely inherent part of European culture. I think that perhaps that might be a straw in the wind. It might reflect shifting views in Germany. I suspect also that the political and crisis in France, which obviously has a social dimension, might be pushing in that same direction also. There will remain hardliners, obviously, in the United States, in Eastern Europe perhaps also. But I think that it is time, it is long overdue, but it is absolutely essential now that the realists, people I'm going to call the realists, finally speak out. Because if they don't, if this offensive runs its course, if the Russians do start taking more strong offensives in the autumn, the situation will be worse, and there is no prospect, even the Pentagon admits the fact, of F-16s or ATACMS missiles or any other miracle weapon that the West believes it might have changing or retrieving the picture. Well, that's my video for today. Less perhaps one involving reporting, just commentary if you like, setting out my own views of where we are in this conflict. And as I said, this is a short video, and that is all I'm going to say. I wish you again a very good day. Remind you once more that you can find all our programs on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin and Telegram. If you support our work, you can do so via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Please remember to check out our shop, links under the video also. And last but not least, if you've liked this short video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel.